The desert sun beat down mercilessly on forward operating Base Coast, where Sergeant Maria Santos checked her medical supplies for the third time that morning. At 26, she had already served 2 tours in Afghanistan, but the other soldiers still saw her as just another field medic, not a real soldier in their eyes, not someone who belonged on the front lines with the infantry. Maria had grown up in East Los Angeles, where her grandmother taught her that healing hands were a gift from God. Her abuela would say, "Mija, when you help someone hurt, you touch their soul." Those words echoed in Maria's mind every time she treated a wounded soldier, every time someone looked at her with doubt in their eyes. The morning briefing was routine. Colonel James Mitchell, a decorated veteran with 30 years of service, outlined the day's patrol routes. Intelligence suggested Taliban activity in the nearby villages, but nothing beyond the usual threats they faced daily. Maria sat in the back row with the other support personnel, watching the infantry soldiers lean forward with interest while she was largely ignored. "Santos," Colonel Mitchell called out as the briefing ended. "You'll be with Alpha Company today. Stay close to Lieutenant Rodriguez." Several soldiers exchanged glances. Maria knew what they were thinking. The field medic was just extra baggage, someone they had to protect rather than someone who could protect them. She had heard the whispers before. Why send a woman? Why not a real soldier? Lieutenant Carlos Rodriguez approached her after the briefing. He was young, maybe 24, with kind eyes that reminded Maria of her younger brother. "Don't worry about the others," he said quietly. "I've read your file. You've saved more lives than most of these guys have seen action." Maria appreciated his words, but she knew actions spoke louder than kindness. She had trained harder than most soldiers, could shoot better than half the unit, and had pulled wounded men from burning vehicles. Yet every day brought the same doubtful looks, the same protective attitudes that made her feel like a burden rather than an asset. The convoy rolled out at 800 hours. 5 Humvees carrying Alpha Company toward a village where villagers had reported strange activity. Maria rode in the third vehicle, her medical bag secured beside her, watching the landscape pass by through bulletproof glass. The terrain was unforgiving, rocky hills, sparse vegetation, and countless places where enemies could hide. Private Johnson sat across from her, barely 18 and on his first deployment. His hands shook slightly as he held his rifle. Maria had seen that look before, young soldiers trying to be brave while fear gnawed at their stomachs. "First time out?" she asked gently. Johnson nodded, embarrassed. "Is it always like this, the waiting?" "The waiting is the hardest part," Maria replied. "But you're ready for this. Your training will kick in when you need it." She meant those words. Every soldier in Alpha Company had undergone months of preparation. They were good soldiers, brave soldiers, even if they didn't always see her as an equal. The radio crackled with routine check-ins as they approached the village. Everything seemed normal, children playing in dusty streets, women hanging laundry, men sitting in the shade discussing daily concerns. Maria had learned to read these scenes. Normal was good. Normal meant families felt safe enough to go about their daily lives. Colonel Mitchell's voice came over the radio from the lead vehicle. "Alpha 6 to all elements. Village appears secure. Dismount and begin patrol as planned." The soldiers filed out of their vehicles with practiced efficiency. Maria grabbed her medical bag and followed Lieutenant Rodriguez toward the village center. Her bag contained enough supplies to treat everything from minor cuts to life-threatening wounds. She had organized every item herself, knowing exactly where to find what she needed in seconds. The villagers seemed genuinely peaceful. An elderly man approached Colonel Mitchell with concerns about a broken water pump. Children gathered around the soldiers, curious about their equipment. Maria noticed a pregnant woman sitting in the shade, looking uncomfortable in the heat. "Ma'am, are you feeling all right?" Maria asked in broken Pashto, approaching the woman slowly. The pregnant woman smiled and nodded, but Maria could see signs of dehydration. She offered water from her own supply and showed the woman how to find a more comfortable position. These small acts of kindness were why she became a medic, not for glory or recognition, but because helping people felt right. Lieutenant Rodriguez joined her after completing his section of the patrol, finding everyone healthy. "Mostly," Maria replied. "That woman needs to drink more water, and I saw a child with what looks like an infected cut on his hand. Nothing serious." "You notice everything," Rodriguez observed. "Most soldiers would miss those details." Maria shrugged. Medical training teaches you to observe. Small problems become big problems if you ignore them. As they prepared to continue their patrol, Maria felt the familiar weight of doubt from some of the other soldiers. Sergeant Williams, a career infantry soldier with multiple deployments, watched her with skeptical eyes. She had proven herself to him before, but some people needed convincing again and again. The patrol moved through the village methodically. Alpha Company was experienced and professional, checking buildings and talking with locals while remaining alert for any signs of trouble. Maria stayed close to Lieutenant Rodriguez as ordered, but she also kept her medical training active, noticing details others might miss. A young boy approached her with a small cut on his finger. His mother followed nervously, unsure whether to trust the foreign soldier. Maria knelt down to the boy's level, smiling and speaking softly while cleaning and bandaging the tiny wound. The mother's expression changed from worry to gratitude. "How do you do that?" Private Johnson asked, watching the interaction. "Do what?" "Make people trust you so quickly." Maria considered the question while packing her medical supplies. "I think people know when someone genuinely wants to help them. It's not about the uniform or the rank. It's about showing up when someone needs you." Those words would prove prophetic in ways she couldn't imagine. The patrol was nearly complete when Colonel Mitchell received an urgent radio call. Intelligence had identified a possible improvised explosive device on their planned return route. The convoy would need to take an alternate path through rougher terrain. "Change of plans," Lieutenant Rodriguez announced to his squad. "We're taking the long way home." The alternate route led through a narrow valley between rocky hills. It was the kind of terrain that made every soldier nervous, limited visibility, multiple potential ambush points, and only one way in or out. But intelligence had confirmed the route was clear, and they had no choice. Maria felt the tension increase as they loaded back into their vehicles. Even Private Johnson seemed more alert now, his earlier nervousness replaced by focused concentration. This was what good training produced: soldiers who could adapt to changing situations. The convoy moved slowly through the valley, drivers carefully navigating the rough track while gunners scanned the surrounding hills. Maria checked her medical supplies again, a habit that had become second nature. In uncertain situations, preparation was everything. "Alpha 6, this is Overwatch," came a voice over the radio. "Be advised, we're seeing movement on the ridgeline to your northeast." Colonel Mitchell's calm voice responded immediately. "Roger, Overwatch. All elements maintain vigilance and continue mission." The movement could be anything: local shepherds, curious villagers, or something more dangerous. In Afghanistan, you never knew until it was too late. Maria watched through her window as the soldiers in her vehicle became even more alert, weapons ready but not threatening. They were halfway through the valley when everything changed. The first explosion came from nowhere, a massive blast that lifted the lead vehicle completely off the ground. Maria's Humvee lurched as their driver instinctively swerved, trying to avoid whatever had hit the convoy commander. "IED, IED," someone screamed over the radio. Through her window, Maria could see Colonel Mitchell's vehicle upside down, smoke pouring from the wreckage. Her medical training kicked in immediately, even before the vehicle stopped moving. Multiple casualties, potential serious injuries, immediate medical attention required. But as their Humvee skidded to a stop, Maria realized this was just the beginning of something much worse. The second explosion hit the rear vehicle, and suddenly Alpha Company was trapped in a kill zone with wounded soldiers and an enemy that had planned this ambush perfectly. Maria grabbed her medical bag as gunfire erupted from the surrounding hills. Through the chaos and noise, she could hear wounded soldiers calling for help. This was the moment she had trained for, the moment that would test everything she believed about herself. Lieutenant Rodriguez was already coordinating their response, but Maria's eyes were fixed on the overturned lead vehicle where Colonel Mitchell and his crew needed immediate medical attention. "Santos, stay in the vehicle," Rodriguez shouted over the gunfire. But Maria was already calculating distances, timing, and the medical needs of wounded soldiers. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. "When you help someone hurt, you touch their soul." The field medic they had seen as just support was about to show them what real soldiers were made of. The battle for Alpha Company had begun, and Maria Santos was ready to prove that healing hands could be just as brave as fighting hands. The gunfire was deafening. Maria pressed herself against the armored door of their Humvee as bullets struck the vehicle like deadly rain. Through the small window, she could see muzzle flashes from at least 6 different positions in the hills surrounding their trapped convoy. Alpha 6 is down! Alpha 6 is down! The radio crackled with desperate voices as soldiers tried to make sense of the ambush. Lieutenant Rodriguez was already on his radio, calling for air support and backup while trying to coordinate their defense. This is Alpha 2-1, we need immediate close air support. Grid coordinates follow. Maria's medical training had taken over completely. She wasn't thinking about bullets or explosions anymore. Her mind was cataloging the wounded based on what she could observe through the chaos. The lead vehicle was overturned and on fire. Colonel Mitchell and at least 3 other soldiers were trapped inside or thrown clear during the explosion. The rear vehicle had taken a direct hit from what looked like a rocket-propelled grenade. She could see 2 soldiers stumbling away from the wreckage, both clearly injured but mobile. Those were good signs they could wait, but the men in the lead vehicle couldn't wait. Santos, Rodriguez grabbed her shoulder. I need you to stay put until we can establish a perimeter. Maria looked at him with steady eyes. Sir, Colonel Mitchell has been unconscious for 3 minutes. If he has internal bleeding or a head injury, every second counts. It's too dangerous. They've got us in a crossfire. People are dying, Lieutenant. Rodriguez saw something in her expression that made him pause. He had read her file, knew about her previous actions under fire, but seeing someone prepare to risk their life was different than reading about it in reports. Private Johnson was pressed against the opposite door, his face pale but his weapon ready. Sergeant Santos, those Taliban fighters have perfect positions up there. They're just waiting for someone to step outside. Maria was already checking her medical bag, making sure she had everything accessible. Tourniquets, pressure bandages, morphine, airway tubes, all the tools she needed to keep people alive until they could reach proper medical facilities. Johnson, you're right about their positions, she said calmly. But they're focusing on our vehicles. They want to pin us down here while they call in reinforcements. That means they might not expect someone to move toward the wounded. The radio came alive with more urgent calls. We've got casualties in Vehicle 1. Colonel Mitchell is trapped. Vehicle 5 has 2 wounded, requesting immediate medical. This is Overwatch. Air support is 20 minutes out. 20 minutes. In combat medicine, 20 minutes could be the difference between soldiers going home to their families or never seeing them again. Maria had seen too many good people die waiting for help that came too late. She looked at Lieutenant Rodriguez again. Sir, I'm going out there. Maria, no, that's an order. For a moment, they stared at each other. Rodriguez was a good officer who cared about his soldiers, but Maria had sworn an oath to help the wounded, regardless of the danger to herself. Sometimes those obligations conflicted with military orders. Lieutenant, with respect, my oath as a medic supersedes other considerations when soldiers are dying. Before Rodriguez could respond, Maria opened the door and rolled out of the Humvee. The world outside was chaos. Dust filled the air from the explosions, making everything hazy and confusing. The crack of rifle fire echoed off the valley walls, creating a symphony of violence that would haunt anyone who survived it. Maria stayed low, using the overturned Humvee as cover while she moved toward the lead vehicle. Her medical training included combat medicine, how to provide care while under fire, how to move in dangerous situations, how to prioritize patients when resources were limited. Behind her, she could hear Rodriguez cursing in both English and Spanish, but she also heard him coordinating covering fire to protect her movement. All elements provide covering fire for our medic. Santos is moving to Vehicle 1. The response was immediate. Every soldier in Alpha Company began laying down suppressive fire toward the enemy positions. They might have questioned her place among them before, but when their medic was risking her life to save their colonel, they would give her every bit of help they could. Maria reached the overturned vehicle and immediately began her assessment. Colonel Mitchell was pinned beneath twisted metal, unconscious but breathing. His face was bloody, and she could see a compound fracture in his left arm. Serious injuries, but not immediately life-threatening if treated properly. Specialist Davis was thrown clear during the explosion, but had landed hard against a rock. He was conscious, but complaining of severe back pain, possible spinal injury. Staff Sergeant Peterson had a deep gash across his forehead that was bleeding heavily but wasn't critical. The worst case was Private Miller, who was trapped in the driver's seat with what looked like internal injuries. His breathing was shallow, his pulse was weak, and blood was pooling beneath the vehicle. Medical triage in combat required brutal decisions. Who could wait? Who needed immediate attention? Who might be saved with the right treatment? Maria made those calculations in seconds, her training taking over completely. Miller first, she said aloud, talking to herself to stay focused. Then Mitchell, then Davis, then Peterson. She crawled under the twisted metal to reach Private Miller. The space was cramped and dangerous, sharp edges everywhere, fuel leaking from the damaged engine, and the constant sound of gunfire overhead. Miller's eyes found hers as she reached him. He was young, maybe 19, with a photo of his girlfriend taped to his helmet. "Am I gonna make it, Doc?" "You're going to be fine," Maria said with complete confidence, even though she could see he had massive internal bleeding. "But I need you to stay still while I work." She started an IV line to get fluids into him, then packed gauze against the worst external bleeding. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, every motion deliberate and necessary. Meanwhile, bullets continued to snap overhead as Alpha Company's return fire kept the enemy from advancing. "Santos," Lieutenant Rodriguez's voice came from their Humvee. "How bad is it?" "4 casualties," she called back. "1 critical, 1 serious, 2 stable." "Can you move them?" Maria looked at the tactical situation. They were still pinned down by enemy fire, the vehicles were either destroyed or damaged, and help was still 15 minutes away. Moving wounded soldiers across open ground under fire was incredibly dangerous. But leaving them here wasn't an option either. "I need a stretcher and 2 volunteers," she shouted. "You've got it." Within minutes, Private Johnson and Specialist Garcia had crawled to her position, bringing a folding stretcher and additional medical supplies. Both soldiers looked terrified but determined. "What do you need us to do, Sergeant?" Johnson asked. Maria was already preparing Private Miller for transport. "Johnson, you're going to help me carry Miller back to the Humvee. Garcia, you're going to help Colonel Mitchell walk if he regains consciousness." "What about Davis and Peterson?" "They can wait until we get the critical cases stabilized." Moving Private Miller required careful coordination. Maria supported his head and monitored his vital signs while Johnson managed the stretcher. The 50 meters back to their vehicle felt like 50 miles, with enemy bullets kicking up dirt around them and the constant fear that one of them would be hit. But Alpha Company provided covering fire that was nothing short of spectacular. Every soldier was shooting with precision and discipline, keeping the Taliban fighters from getting clean shots at the medical team. They reached the Humvee successfully, and Maria immediately began more intensive treatment on Private Miller. He was going into shock, which meant his injuries were even worse than she had initially assessed. "Rodriguez," she called to the lieutenant, "I need you to radio for immediate medical evacuation. Miller won't survive the trip back to base without surgical intervention." "Medevac is already en route," Rodriguez replied, "but they can't land until we secure the landing zone." Maria understood the tactical problem. The Taliban had chosen their ambush site perfectly. The narrow valley gave them commanding positions while limiting the Americans' options for escape or rescue. But while she was treating Miller, Maria noticed something the infantry soldiers had missed. The enemy fire was coming from 6 positions, but the timing wasn't coordinated. Each group of fighters was acting independently rather than following a unified plan. "Lieutenant," she called to Rodriguez while continuing to work on Miller, "the enemy positions aren't communicating well with each other. If you could coordinate simultaneous fire on all 6 positions, you might be able to suppress them long enough for the medevac to land." Rodriguez looked at her with surprise. Field medics weren't supposed to provide tactical advice to infantry officers. But her observation was correct. He could see it now that she had pointed it out. "All elements, this is Alpha 2-1, Rodriguez spoke into his radio. "Prepare for simultaneous suppression of all enemy positions on my mark." While Rodriguez coordinated the tactical response, Maria continued treating Private Miller. His blood pressure was dropping, and she was running out of ways to stabilize him with field medical supplies. "Stay with me, Miller," she whispered as she checked his pulse again. Your girlfriend is waiting for you to come home. The photograph on his helmet showed a young woman with blonde hair and a beautiful smile, probably a high school sweetheart who was counting the days until his deployment ended. Maria thought about all the families who would receive terrible news if she couldn't keep these soldiers alive. Colonel Mitchell was beginning to regain consciousness, which was a good sign for his head injury. But his arm was definitely broken, and he was showing signs of internal bleeding from the explosion. "Colonel, can you hear me?" Maria asked while applying a pressure bandage to his worst external wound. Mitchell's eyes focused on her slowly. "Santos, what's our situation?" "We're pinned down by enemy fire, sir, but help is coming. I need you to stay still while I treat your injuries." "My men, I'm taking care of them, sir." Maria could see the leadership instinct in Colonel Mitchell even while he was seriously injured. He wanted to know about his soldiers, wanted to coordinate their defense, wanted to make sure everyone got home safely. "Colonel, the best thing you can do right now is let Lieutenant Rodriguez handle the tactics while I handle the medical. Your men need you alive more than they need you giving orders." It was a bold thing to say to a senior officer, but Maria had learned that wounded soldiers, regardless of rank, needed clear, direct guidance about their medical care. The sound of helicopter rotors was growing louder in the distance. The medevac was approaching, but the tactical situation was still dangerous. Maria looked at her casualties and made rapid calculations about who could be moved first. Miller was still critical but stable enough for transport. Colonel Mitchell was serious but could wait a few more minutes. Davis and Peterson were still trapped at the overturned vehicle and would need to be retrieved. "Santos," Rodriguez called to her. "Medevac is 2 minutes out. They need to know how many casualties we're loading." "4 total," Maria called back while checking Miller's IV line. "1 critical, 1 serious, 2 stable." "Can you have them ready?" Maria looked at the tactical situation one more time. The Taliban fighters were still in their positions, still capable of shooting down a medical helicopter if they got lucky. But American soldiers were dying, and that wasn't acceptable. "I'll have them ready," she promised. As the helicopter approached, Maria made a decision that would define the rest of her military career. Instead of waiting for the entry to secure the landing zone, she was going to make sure it happened herself. The medical helicopter appeared over the ridge like an angel of mercy, its rotor blades beating against the desert air. But Maria could see the problem immediately. The landing zone was still under enemy observation, and the Taliban fighters would have clear shots at the aircraft during landing and takeoff. "This is Dustoff 7-2, the pilot's voice crackled over the radio. "I need that landing zone secured before I can set down." Lieutenant Rodriguez was coordinating suppressive fire from their defensive positions, but 6 enemy positions were too much to neutralize with their limited numbers. The Taliban fighters were smart enough to stay in cover between American fire missions, then pop up to engage whenever they saw movement. Maria looked at Private Miller, whose vital signs were getting weaker despite her best efforts. His blood pressure was dropping, and his skin was turning pale and clammy, classic signs of shock from internal bleeding. He needed surgical intervention within the next 30 minutes, or he wouldn't survive. "Rodriguez," she called to the lieutenant. "Miller can't wait. If that helicopter doesn't land soon, we're going to lose him." "I'm doing everything I can, Santos," Rodriguez replied, frustration clear in his voice. "But I can't eliminate 6 enemy positions with 12 soldiers." Maria studied the tactical situation while continuing to monitor Miller's condition. The Taliban fighters were positioned in a rough semicircle around the valley, each group separated by several hundred meters. They were using the terrain expertly, staying hidden among the rocks and sparse vegetation. But medical training had taught Maria to look at problems differently than infantry soldiers. Where they saw 6 separate enemy positions that needed to be defeated, she saw a pattern of behavior that might be exploited. "Lieutenant, can I make a suggestion?" Rodriguez looked at her with surprise. In the middle of a firefight, the last thing he expected was tactical advice from his medic. But her earlier observation about enemy coordination had been correct, so he was willing to listen. "Go ahead. The enemy positions are reacting to our movements, not initiating their own attacks. They're defensive-minded, trying to prevent rescue rather than destroy us completely. That means they'll focus on the biggest threat." Which is the helicopter. If I can draw their attention while Dustoff 72 approaches, they might focus their fire on me instead of the aircraft. Rodriguez stared at her as if she had lost her mind. Santos, that's suicide. You'd be completely exposed. Not if I'm moving toward the casualties at the overturned vehicle. They'll see me as a medical threat, not a tactical one. And if they're shooting at me, they're not shooting at the helicopter. The idea was insane, but it might work. Maria had noticed that the Taliban fighters hadn't targeted her directly during her previous movement to treat the wounded. They had focused their fire on the soldiers providing covering fire and the vehicles that represented military threats. Absolutely not, Rodriguez said firmly. I'm not sending my medic out as a distraction. Sir, Private Miller is going to die without immediate evacuation. Colonel Mitchell needs surgical treatment for internal bleeding. Davis might have spinal injuries that could paralyze him permanently without proper care. Sometimes the medic has to take risks to save lives. Before Rodriguez could argue further, Colonel Mitchell spoke up from his position on the stretcher. Despite his injuries, the colonel had been listening to their conversation and understanding the tactical situation. Rodriguez, Mitchell said weakly but clearly, let her do it. Sir, Santos knows her job better than anyone. If she thinks this will work, trust her judgment. Maria felt a surge of gratitude toward Colonel Mitchell. Even wounded and facing his own medical crisis, he was supporting her professional assessment of the situation. Colonel, you need to save your strength, she said while checking his bandages. My men come first, Santos. They always come first. Maria understood that sentiment completely. Her patients always came first too, regardless of the danger to herself. That was the oath she had taken, the commitment she had made when she chose to become a combat medic. Dustoff 72, this is Alpha 21, Rodriguez spoke into his radio. Be advised, we're going to attempt distraction maneuver to secure your landing zone. Stand by for further instructions. Roger, Alpha 21, standing by. Maria was already preparing for movement. She grabbed additional medical supplies and made sure her rifle was loaded and ready. Her plan was simple but dangerous. Move toward the casualties at the overturned vehicle while the helicopter approached, drawing enemy fire away from the aircraft. Johnson, Garcia, she called to the two soldiers who had helped her earlier. I need you to provide covering fire from here while I move to retrieve Davis and Peterson. Sergeant, let us come with you, Johnson volunteered. No, I need you here to help load the critical casualties when the helicopter lands. This is a one-person mission. Maria checked her watch. The helicopter was circling at a safe distance, waiting for clearance to land. Miller's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and Colonel Mitchell was showing signs of increased internal bleeding. Rodriguez, give me 60 seconds to reach the overturned vehicle, then have Dustoff 72 begin his approach. Santos, Rodriguez looked like he wanted to say something more, but couldn't find the words. I'll be fine, Lieutenant. This is what I trained for. Maria took a deep breath and sprinted from cover toward the overturned vehicle 50 meters away. Immediately, the enemy positions erupted with gunfire. Bullets kicked up dirt around her feet and snapped through the air close enough that she could hear their passage. But she had been right about the Taliban fighters' mindset. They saw her as a target of opportunity rather than a primary threat, so their fire was hasty and poorly aimed. Most of their shots went wide as she zigzagged toward the casualties. Dustoff 72, begin your approach now, Rodriguez commanded over the radio. The helicopter swung around the ridge and began descending toward the improvised landing zone. As Maria had predicted, the Taliban fighters immediately shifted their focus to the aircraft. The helicopter represented a much more significant threat. It could evacuate their targets and bring in reinforcements. Maria reached the overturned vehicle just as the concentrated enemy fire began targeting the helicopter. Specialist Davis was still conscious, but complaining of severe back pain and numbness in his legs, definitely spinal injuries. Davis, I'm going to get you out of here, she said while checking his condition quickly. Doc, I can't feel my legs. That might be temporary swelling from the explosion. We won't know for sure until we get you to proper medical facilities. Staff Sergeant Peterson had a deep head wound that was bleeding heavily but wasn't immediately life-threatening. He was conscious and alert, which meant his brain function wasn't compromised. Peterson, can you walk with assistance? I think so, Sergeant. Maria could hear the helicopter landing behind their position, while enemy fire continued to target the aircraft. She had maybe 2 minutes before the pilot would have to take off for safety reasons. Davis, I'm going to move you very carefully to a spine board. Peterson, you're going to help me carry him. Moving a patient with potential spinal injuries required extreme caution under normal circumstances. Doing it under enemy fire while a helicopter waited for evacuation was nearly impossible. But Maria had trained for exactly these kinds of impossible situations. She slipped a rigid spine board under Davis while supporting his head and neck to prevent further injury. Peterson, despite his own head wound, helped lift the board when she was ready. Alpha 2-1, this is Dustoff 7-2, the helicopter pilot called over the radio. I'm taking fire from multiple positions. I need immediate suppression or I'll have to abort. All elements concentrate fire on enemy positions, Rodriguez commanded. Keep those heads down. The combined fire from Alpha Company was impressive, but the Taliban fighters were well-positioned and determined. They continued shooting at the helicopter while Maria and Peterson struggled to carry Davis across the rocky ground. The spine board was awkward and heavy, especially with Peterson weakened by his own injuries. They stumbled twice, and each time Maria had to make sure Davis's head and neck remained stable. Almost there, she encouraged Peterson, who was bleeding from his forehead wound and clearly struggling. 20 meters from the helicopter, Peterson collapsed. The blood loss and exertion had overwhelmed him, and he couldn't continue carrying Davis. Sergeant, I'm sorry, Peterson gasped. I can't. Maria looked at the situation. The helicopter was 30 seconds from having to abort the mission. Davis was paralyzed and couldn't move himself. Peterson was unconscious from blood loss, and she was the only person in position to get them to safety. Without hesitation, Maria grabbed the spine board and began dragging it toward the helicopter by herself. Davis weighed at least 180 pounds, and the board added another 30 pounds. The distance to the helicopter might as well have been a mile. But she had grown up in East Los Angeles, where her grandmother taught her that determination could overcome any obstacle. Mija, Abuela used to say, when God gives you strength, you use all of it. Maria used all of it. Step by step, she pulled Davis toward the helicopter while enemy bullets continued to snap overhead. Her legs burned, her lungs gasped for air, and sweat poured down her face despite the desert heat. Come on, Davis, she gasped as she pulled. Your family is waiting for you. The helicopter crew chief jumped out to help when she got within 10 meters of the aircraft. Together, they loaded Davis into the helicopter while the pilots kept the rotors spinning. Peterson, Maria called to the crew chief, pointing back toward the unconscious staff sergeant. The crew chief nodded and followed her back to retrieve Peterson. By the time they got him loaded into the helicopter, enemy fire was increasing as the Taliban fighters realized their targets were escaping. Dustoff 7-2, we need to go now, the pilot called over the aircraft's intercom. But Maria was already running back toward their defensive position where Miller and Colonel Mitchell were waiting. The helicopter could take 4 patients, and she wasn't leaving anyone behind. Santos, get back here, Rodriguez shouted over the noise of rotors and gunfire. Maria reached their position as Johnson and Garcia were loading Miller into the helicopter. His condition had stabilized during the evacuation of the other casualties, but he still needed immediate surgery. Colonel Mitchell was the last patient to load. Despite his injuries, he insisted on walking to the helicopter under his own power rather than being carried. Colonel, you should be on a stretcher, Maria argued. Save the stretcher for someone who needs it more, Mitchell replied with a weak smile. As the helicopter prepared to take off with all 4 casualties, Maria realized she had accomplished something that seemed impossible 30 minutes earlier. Every wounded soldier was alive, every injury was treated, and everyone was going home to their families. But as Dustoff 7-2 lifted off under continued enemy fire, Maria understood that her real test was just beginning. Alpha Company was still trapped in the valley with limited ammunition, no vehicles, and enemy fighters who were now extremely angry that their targets had escaped. The helicopter disappeared over the ridge, carrying Colonel Mitchell and the other wounded soldiers toward the military hospital at Bagram Airfield. Maria watched until the aircraft was completely out of sight, then turned her attention back to the immediate tactical situation. Alpha Company was down to 8 effective soldiers, trapped in a valley with damaged vehicles and an enemy that was regrouping for what looked like a major assault. Without Colonel Mitchell's leadership and experience, Lieutenant Rodriguez was now the senior officer present, and Maria could see the weight of command settling on his young shoulders. "Santos, get over here," Rodriguez called from behind their damaged Humvee. Maria gathered her remaining medical supplies and moved to Rodriguez's position. The lieutenant was studying a tactical map, while Private Johnson maintained watch toward the enemy positions. "What's our situation, sir?" Maria asked. "Not good," Rodriguez replied honestly. "We've got 8 soldiers, limited ammunition, no working vehicles, and intelligence suggests enemy reinforcements are moving toward our position." "How long until our backup arrives?" 40 minutes minimum, maybe longer if they encounter resistance en route." 40 minutes. Maria calculated rapidly in her mind. With Alpha Company's current ammunition supplies and the enemy's apparent numbers, they might not be able to hold their position for 40 minutes against a determined assault. "Lieutenant, can I make another tactical suggestion?" Rodriguez looked at her with tired eyes. "At this point, I'll listen to anyone with ideas." Maria pointed to the map Rodriguez was studying. "The enemy has been content to keep us pinned down rather than overrun our position. That suggests they're waiting for something, probably reinforcements or better positioning." "Agreed, what's your point?" "If we stay here, we're fighting on their terms. But if we can move to a more defensible position, we might be able to hold out until help arrives." Rodriguez studied the map more carefully. "There's a ridgeline about 400 meters east of here. Better fields of fire, more cover, but getting there would mean crossing open ground under enemy observation. The enemy positions are focused on this valley because they expect us to stay with our vehicles. They might not be prepared for movement in a different direction." It was another calculated risk, like her decision to draw enemy fire during the medical evacuation. But Maria's medical training had taught her to think systematically about problems and look for solutions that others might miss. Before Rodriguez could respond, the radio crackled with an urgent message from their command post. "Alpha 2-1, this is base. Be advised, intercepts indicate large enemy force moving toward your position. Estimate company-sized element with heavy weapons." A company-sized enemy force meant 60 to 80 fighters, possibly with mortars or rocket-propelled grenades. Against Alpha Company's 8 remaining soldiers, those odds were impossible. "Base, this is Alpha 2-1. Request immediate close air support." "Alpha 2-1, air support is committed to another engagement. Earliest availability is 1 hour." Rodriguez closed his eyes for a moment, processing the tactical nightmare they were facing. 8 American soldiers against 60 Taliban fighters, with no air support and limited ammunition. Maria watched the lieutenant struggle with the tactical decision. He was a good officer, but he was also very young and had never commanded in a situation this desperate. "Sir," she said quietly, "what would Colonel Mitchell do?" Rodriguez looked at her with something like gratitude. "He'd move to better ground and make the enemy come to us." "Then that's what we'll do." The decision was made. Alpha Company would abandon their vehicles and move to the ridgeline where they could establish a more defensible position. It was risky, but staying put was certain death. "All elements, this is Alpha 2-1, Rodriguez spoke into his radio. "Prepare for tactical movement to grid coordinates." He gave the map location of the ridgeline. "We move in 60 seconds. Maria quickly redistributed her medical supplies among the soldiers. In a fighting withdrawal, every soldier needed to be able to provide basic first aid to themselves and their teammates. "Johnson, you're carrying extra tourniquets and pressure bandages," she said while handing him medical supplies. "Garcia, you get the morphine and airway tubes." "What about you, Sergeant?" Johnson asked. "I'm carrying everything else." Maria's medical pack was now twice as heavy as normal, but she couldn't afford to leave critical supplies behind. If anyone was wounded during the movement, she needed to be able to treat them immediately. "All right, people," Rodriguez addressed the remaining soldiers of Alpha Company. "We're going to move in 2 teams. Team 1 moves first while Team 2 provides covering fire, then we reverse roles. Stay low, stay fast, and watch your intervals. The plan was simple but dangerous. 4 soldiers would run toward the ridgeline while the other 4 kept enemy heads down with suppressive fire. Then the roles would reverse, allowing everyone to reach better ground. "Santos, you're with the first movement team," Rodriguez ordered. "Sir, shouldn't the medics stay with the rear guard in case someone gets hit during the withdrawal?" "If someone gets hit during withdrawal, the best thing you can do is reach defensive positions where you can treat them safely." Maria understood the logic, but it felt wrong to leave soldiers behind even temporarily. Her instinct was to stay close to whoever might need medical attention. "Besides," Rodriguez added with a slight smile, "after what you did during the medical evacuation, I trust your ability to move under fire." The 8 soldiers of Alpha Company prepared for what might be their final tactical movement together. They had trained for this kind of situation, but training never fully prepared anyone for the reality of combat. "Team 1, move out," Rodriguez commanded. Maria sprinted from cover alongside Johnson, Garcia, and Specialist Williams. Immediately, enemy fire erupted from the surrounding hills as the Taliban fighters realized the Americans were moving. But this time was different from her earlier movement to treat casualties. This time, she was running with infantry soldiers who knew how to move under fire. They used every bit of cover available, changed direction randomly to confuse enemy aim, and maintained proper intervals to prevent multiple casualties from a single enemy shot. The 400 meters to the ridgeline felt like 4 miles. Bullets snapped overhead and kicked up dirt around their feet, but Maria's earlier assessment had been correct. The enemy wasn't prepared for movement in this direction, and their fire was less accurate than it could have been. "Almost there," Garcia called as they approached the base of the ridgeline. The climb up the rocky slope required careful coordination. They were completely exposed during the ascent, but Rodriguez's second team was providing excellent covering fire from their original position. Maria's medical pack felt like it weighed 100 pounds as she climbed over rocks and through sparse vegetation. But she kept thinking about Colonel Mitchell's words, "My men come first. They always come first." These soldiers were her men now. She was responsible for keeping them alive, just as much as Rodriguez was responsible for tactical decisions. "Team 1 in position." Rodriguez's voice came over the radio as they reached defensive positions on the ridgeline. "Team 2, move out." Now it was Maria's turn to provide covering fire, while Rodriguez led the second group across the open ground. She had qualified as expert with her rifle during training, but shooting at enemy positions to protect her teammates felt different than shooting at paper targets. Through her rifle scope, she could see muzzle flashes from the enemy positions. She aimed carefully and squeezed the trigger, trying to keep the Taliban fighters from getting clean shots at Rodriguez's team. "Come on, Lieutenant," she whispered while continuing to fire. "Move fast." Rodriguez's team made the crossing successfully, but Maria could see that the enemy was adapting to their new positions. The Taliban fighters were beginning to maneuver closer, probably preparing for an assault on the ridgeline. "Alpha 2-1, this is base," the radio crackled with another update. "Enemy reinforcements have reached your area. Count approximately 60 fighters with crew-served weapons." 60 fighters with crew-served weapons meant machine guns and mortars, weapons that could destroy Alpha Company's defensive position quickly and efficiently. "Base, what's the status on our reinforcements?" Rodriguez asked. "Alpha 2-1, friendly forces are 30 minutes out." 30 minutes. Against 60 Taliban fighters with heavy weapons, 30 minutes was an eternity. Maria looked at the 7 soldiers around her, young men who had followed orders without question, trusted their officers completely, and performed with extraordinary courage under impossible circumstances. Private Johnson, barely 18, was checking his ammunition and preparing defensive positions with the calm professionalism of a veteran. Specialist Garcia was coordinating fields of fire with Williams and the other soldiers, as if this was just another training exercise. These weren't the same soldiers who had looked at her with doubt and skepticism during the morning briefing. Combat had transformed them into a team that trusted each other completely. "Santos," Rodriguez called to her from his command position, "how much medical supplies do we have left?" Maria inventoried her remaining equipment quickly. Enough for basic trauma care, but not enough for sustained casualties. Understood, stay close to the command post. If we take casualties during the assault, I need you centrally located. As if summoned by Rodriguez's words, the sound of incoming mortar rounds whistled through the air. The Taliban fighters had brought indirect fire weapons, and they were preparing to soften Alpha Company's positions before their infantry assault. Incoming, someone shouted. The first mortar round exploded 20 meters from their position, showering the ridgeline with rocks and dust. Maria pressed herself against the rocky ground and tried to make herself as small as possible. More explosions followed as the enemy mortar crew found their range. Each blast was getting closer to Alpha Company's defensive positions. "They're bracketing us," Rodriguez observed grimly. Maria understood military terminology well enough to know what that meant. The enemy mortar crew was adjusting their aim systematically, walking their explosive rounds closer and closer until they achieved direct hits. "How long until they find our exact position?" she asked. "Maybe 5 minutes." 5 minutes before the Taliban fighters dropped high-explosive rounds directly on their defensive positions. 5 minutes before Alpha Company would be forced to abandon their carefully prepared fields of fire. But as Maria listened to the incoming mortar rounds and watched her teammates prepare for the final battle, she realized that 30 minutes was longer than she had initially thought. 30 minutes was enough time for 8 determined soldiers to show 60 enemy fighters what American military training really meant. The battle for the ridgeline was about to begin, and Sergeant Maria Santos was ready to prove once again that field medics belonged on the front lines with the infantry. The mortar rounds were walking closer to their position with each explosion. Maria could feel the concussion from each blast, and loose rocks were beginning to rain down on Alpha Company's defensive positions. The Taliban fighters had found their range and were preparing to destroy the ridgeline systematically. "Next round is going to be close," Rodriguez warned over the sound of incoming ordnance. The explosion came 20 feet from Maria's position, close enough that the blast wave knocked the wind out of her lungs and filled her mouth with dust and debris. When the smoke cleared, she could see that Specialist Williams had been hit by shrapnel in his shoulder. "Medic," Williams called out, more from training than actual pain. Maria low-crawled to Williams's position while mortar rounds continued to impact around them. The shrapnel wound wasn't life-threatening, but it was bleeding heavily and would compromise his fighting effectiveness if left untreated. "Hold still," she said while cutting away his uniform to access the wound. "Doc, just patch me up quick," Williams said through gritted teeth. "I need to get back on my rifle." Maria worked rapidly, cleaning the wound and applying a pressure bandage while explosions continued around them. Williams was right. They needed every rifle firing during the upcoming infantry assault. "You're good to go," she said, helping him back to his fighting position. "Thanks, Doc." As Maria returned to the command post, she could hear Rodriguez coordinating with their remaining ammunition supplies. Each soldier had maybe 60 rounds remaining, plus whatever ammunition they could recover from their damaged vehicles if they survived the mortar barrage. "Alpha 2-1, this is base," the radio crackled with another update. "Friendly forces are 25 minutes out. Hold your position." 25 minutes. Maria looked at the 8 soldiers of Alpha Company and wondered if any of them would be alive when help arrived. The mathematics were simple and brutal: 60 Taliban fighters with unlimited ammunition against 8 Americans with limited supplies. But mathematics didn't account for training, determination, or the bonds that formed between soldiers under fire. "Santos," Rodriguez called to her, "I need you to do something for me." "What do you need, sir?" Rodriguez handed her a small notebook and a pen. "I need you to write down the grid coordinates of our position and the direction of enemy movement. If something happens to me, you'll need to call in our reinforcements." Maria understood what Rodriguez was really asking. He was giving her command responsibility in case the officers were killed or wounded. It was both an honor and a terrible burden. "Lieutenant, nothing is going to happen to you." "Maybe not, but if it does, these men need leadership, and you've shown more tactical sense today than some officers I've served with." Maria took the notebook and carefully wrote down the information Rodriguez provided. Grid coordinates, enemy positions, ammunition status, casualty reports, all the details that would help their rescuers find them and defeat the Taliban fighters. The mortar barrage stopped suddenly, which meant the infantry assault was about to begin. In the sudden silence, Maria could hear voices calling in a foreign language from the valley below. The enemy was coordinating their attack. "Here they come," Rodriguez said quietly into his radio. "All elements prepare for infantry assault from multiple directions." Maria checked her rifle one final time and made sure her remaining medical supplies were accessible. During the coming battle, she would need to function as both medic and rifleman, treating wounded soldiers while helping to defend their position. "Garcia, Johnson, Williams, take the eastern approaches," Rodriguez commanded. "Peterson, Martinez, Davis, cover the western slope. Santos, you're with me at the command post." The tactical deployment made sense. Rodriguez needed someone at the command post who could coordinate medical treatment and communicate with their reinforcements. But Maria also understood that he was keeping her in the most protected position possible. "Sir, I should be where the casualties are most likely." "Santos, the casualties are going to be everywhere. Stay central so you can reach anyone who needs help." The first enemy fighters appeared on the eastern slope, moving in small groups and using available cover effectively. These weren't the poorly trained insurgents that some American soldiers faced. These Taliban fighters were experienced, disciplined, and determined to overrun Alpha Company's position. "Contact east," Garcia called out as he opened fire. The battle erupted across the entire ridgeline as Taliban fighters attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. The sound was deafening: rifle fire, grenade explosions, shouted commands in English and Pashto, and the constant crack of bullets passing overhead. Maria's medical training took over completely. She was monitoring the tactical situation for signs of casualties while providing accurate rifle fire toward enemy positions. Her rifle scope allowed her to identify individual targets and engage them with precision. "Johnson's hit," Williams called from the eastern position. Maria immediately moved toward Johnson's position while Rodriguez coordinated the overall defense. Johnson had taken a bullet through his left arm, but he was still conscious and able to fight. "How bad is it?" Johnson asked as Maria began treating his wound. "Clean through and through," she replied while applying a pressure bandage. "You'll be fine, but try to use your right hand for shooting." "Roger, Doc." Maria was moving back toward the command post when she heard an explosion from the western slope. One of the Taliban fighters had gotten close enough to throw a grenade into Alpha Company's defensive positions. "Martinez is down," Peterson called out. Martinez had caught grenade fragments in his chest and legs. When Maria reached him, she could see that his injuries were serious but treatable with immediate care. "Talk to me, Martinez," she said while cutting away his uniform to assess the wounds. "Can't breathe right," Martinez gasped. One of the grenade fragments had punctured his lung, causing it to partially collapse. Maria had treated this injury before, but never under enemy fire while a battle raged around her. "I'm going to fix your breathing," she said while preparing a chest seal to treat the punctured lung. The medical procedure required her complete attention for several minutes while bullets snapped overhead and explosions continued around their position. But Martinez's breathing improved immediately after she applied the chest seal. "Better?" she asked. "Much better, Doc, thanks." "Stay down and keep pressure on those leg wounds. I'll be back to check on you." As Maria moved between casualties, she began to understand the tactical situation more clearly. The Taliban fighters were using their numerical advantage to attack simultaneously from multiple directions, but they weren't coordinating their assaults effectively. Each group of enemy fighters was advancing independently, which meant Alpha Company could defeat them one section at a time rather than being overwhelmed by a unified assault. "Rodriguez," she called to the lieutenant while reloading her rifle, "the enemy attacks aren't synchronized." "What do you mean?" "The eastern group is advancing ahead of the western group. If we concentrate our fire on one direction at a time, we can defeat each attack separately." Rodriguez immediately understood her tactical observation. "All elements, concentrate fire on eastern approaches, suppress that advance." The combined firepower of Alpha Company's remaining soldiers was devastating when focused on a single target. The Taliban fighters approaching from the east were forced back with heavy casualties. "Now shift fire to the western slope," Rodriguez commanded. The western group of enemy fighters was caught advancing in the open when Alpha Company's concentrated fire hit them. Several Taliban fighters were killed or wounded, and the remainder retreated to cover. Maria's tactical suggestion had worked perfectly. By defeating each enemy group separately, Alpha Company was holding their position against overwhelming odds. But the victory was temporary. Maria could see more enemy fighters moving up the slopes, and Alpha Company's ammunition was running dangerously low. "Sir," she said to Rodriguez while treating another shrapnel wound, "how much ammunition do we have left?" "Maybe 10 minutes of sustained combat." 10 minutes? Their reinforcements were still 15 minutes away, which meant Alpha Company would run out of ammunition before help arrived. "Alpha 2-1, this is base," the radio provided another update. "Friendly forces report enemy blocking positions on approach routes. Estimated arrival time now 30 minutes. 30 minutes. Maria felt her heart sink as she realized they were not going to be rescued in time. But as she looked around at the soldiers of Alpha Company, she saw something that surprised her. Instead of despair or panic, she saw determination and calm professionalism. These young soldiers had accepted that they might not survive the next 30 minutes, and they were prepared to fight until the end. "Santos," Rodriguez called to her, "I need you to take over radio communications with base." "Sir." "Call in our final position report. Tell them where we are and what we've accomplished. Make sure they know that Alpha Company followed orders and completed their mission." Maria understood what Rodriguez was really asking. He wanted her to ensure that their families would know they had died as soldiers, fighting to the end and never surrendering. But as she reached for the radio, Maria heard a sound that changed everything. The distinctive roar of jet engines approaching at high speed. "Alpha 2-1, this is Hog 4-1, a new voice came over the radio. "I've got eyes on your position and enemy forces, ready to provide close air support." Close air support? An A-10 Warthog ground attack aircraft, specifically designed to destroy enemy forces in close proximity to friendly troops. "Hog 4-1, this is Alpha 2-1, Rodriguez responded immediately. "Enemy forces are advancing on our position from multiple directions. We are taking effective fire and request immediate support." "Alpha 2-1, mark your position with smoke and take cover. Danger close fire mission incoming." Rodriguez threw a smoke grenade to mark their position, while the soldiers of Alpha Company pressed themselves against the rocky ground. Maria could hear the A-10 aircraft diving toward the Taliban positions, its engines screaming like an avenging angel. The sound of the A-10's 30 cannon was unlike anything Maria had ever experienced. The aircraft's GAU-8 gun fired depleted uranium rounds at a rate of thousands per minute, turning enemy positions into dust and debris. The first gun run lasted only seconds, but it eliminated half the Taliban fighters attacking from the eastern slope. The A-10 pulled up and circled for another attack, while the remaining enemy fighters tried to find cover. "Alpha 2-1, how's that look?" the pilot asked. "Outstanding, Hog 4-1. Request you service the western slope next." The second gun run was equally devastating. Maria watched through her rifle scope as the A-10's cannon fire walked across the Taliban positions, eliminating the remaining organized resistance. In less than 5 minutes, 60 enemy fighters had been reduced to scattered survivors fleeing in all directions. "Alpha 2-1, this is base," came another radio call. "Friendly forces are crossing the valley floor. Estimate arrival in 10 minutes. "Roger base, landing zone is secure." As the sound of approaching helicopters filled the air, Maria looked around at the soldiers of Alpha Company. They had survived against impossible odds through teamwork, determination, and tactical intelligence. But more importantly, they had proven something to themselves and to each other. Sergeant Maria Santos was no longer seen as only a field medic. She was a soldier who had earned her place among infantry fighters through demonstrated courage and competence under fire. Private Johnson approached her as they prepared for extraction. "Sergeant, I owe you an apology." "For what, Johnson?" "For thinking you didn't belong with us. You saved all our lives today, not just the wounded ones." "We saved each other, Johnson. That's what soldiers do." As the rescue helicopters landed and Alpha Company prepared for evacuation, Maria thought about Colonel Mitchell and the other wounded soldiers she had treated. They were safe now, recovering in military hospitals and preparing to return to their families. Every soldier was going home, every mission had been completed, every life had been saved. For a field medic who had grown up believing that healing hands were a gift from God, there was no greater victory than that. The helicopter lifted off, carrying the survivors of Alpha Company toward safety. Below them, the valley where they had fought so desperately grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared completely. Maria Santos had proven herself as a soldier, a medic, and a leader under the most extreme circumstances possible. She would never again be seen as only anything. She was simply and completely a warrior who happened to carry medical supplies instead of extra ammunition, and that made all the difference in the world.